Welcome, witches, wizards, and muggles alike, to another enchanting episode of Magical Tales from the Slytherin Common Room, bringing your favorite Harry Potter fan fiction to audio format. So sit back, relax, and Accio headphones, and let the magic begin. Greenlight, Chapter 13. It happens as strange and mystical as this. One day you wake up, and everything you have been running from disappears. Sophia Al-Jabbar, 1915. Time stretches out and oscillates into itself like the tracing of a shell. Regardless of where Hermione puts her finger, she can follow the engraved swirls and choose where to stop and when to continue. She can go all the way to the beginning, the small space where the shell curves into itself, and she can find herself as a child once more. Time had no meaning then. It was infinite, all-consuming, uncomplicated. If she moves forward, she'll find herself at Hogwarts, and time becomes quicksand, the speed of it pacing as quickly as each beat of her frantic heart. And if she's brave enough, she can try to push the veil aside and take a peek into who she is a year or two from now. Who she is tomorrow. She might see a hazy version of herself, a rough outline of her body waiting for all the colors to be drawn in. The lack of control over who she may become makes her nervous, and maybe that's why she's stuck in the past. There's comfort in the frightening memories. She realizes the ghosts of her past haunt her present, or maybe she's the ghost living in the now. But at least she can look back and see where she went wrong, rather than deciphering what may go wrong. So many decisions were made in a single passing moment, and almost none of them changed her life. But then she finds herself stumbling across certain periods of time where each moment is extended to its limit. Her fingers grazing along the edge of the shell, and a single decision changes everything. And suddenly, time becomes an overstretched rubber band, pulled to its maximum length, taut and ready to spring back to its moment. This moment right now, as Hermione stands outside of the cottage, eyes closed and face tilted towards the sky. She didn't sleep much after last night, barely managed to get in half an hour. Lena stopped Hermione after breakfast, pulling her aside in the hallway. She'd written a letter to her daughter and was going to send it today. She wanted to meet Mona before the wedding, spend some time with her so that she could explain. Lena didn't know exactly what needed to be said or what the right words were. She just knew she was going to ask for forgiveness first. She'd make sure to not push aside all the grief Mona must have felt. Her daughter deserved an apology. Lena could hardly keep her emotions in, tears cascading down her cheek, and as she stumbled over the words that had been hidden inside her for too long. She showed Hermione the letter and explained that it was because of her that she'd written it, and then Hermione was pulled into a hug. Lena's arms wrapping around her back and holding her tight to her chest, and it took everything in her not to fall apart. This is what it felt like, she reminded herself. This is what it felt like to hug Mom. Hermione opens her eyes as the fingers of the wind graze her cheek. It's a cool morning, the air relieved of its humidity after last night's storm. The sun is out, and the cracks of daylight seep through the treetops, creating rays of honeyed warmth. She looks up and watches the trees sigh and heave towards each other. Crown shyness. That's what her father had told her about the trees. The strange way they create an intricate web that allows them to get close enough to the other trees, but never enough to fully touch. To avoid getting hurt, he said. They get close, but never enough to collide. Over time, some of the trees will even learn the way the other trees grow, and they'll change themselves to avoid damaging the others. Her eyes drop to her trembling hands. She watches a slight shake of her fingers, of her palms, and realizes they're never steady anymore. It seems her hands second-guess everything now. And then there's the fact that everything she is, everything she knows to be true, doesn't belong to her. She's made of the words written or spoken by others, and she'd give anything to hear those words again. She'd give herself up if it meant that she too could write a letter telling her parents that she wanted to hear them speak once more. Hermione struggles to keep herself together, so she bypasses the buzzing in her body and turns in the direction of the cliff. She closes her eyes again and concentrates, honing on the one sound she needs to hear. And there, just in the near distance, she hears the ocean humming like a slumbering beast. Come closer, it begs. Come and see me. Regardless of what she might think, this present moment in time is stained by all the ones before, and she's indefinitely stuck. She needs to wash it all away if she ever wants to move forward. Hermione shivers, the hair on the nape of her neck rises, and she opens her eyes, looking into the trees at the path that she ran last night. It had been so close. Her mind races, and she blinks once when she makes her decision. It's different now. It has to be different, and then without thinking, she takes a step forward and then another, and before she falls into a run. She knows where she's going, her legs carrying her down the familiar woven path between the trees. Faster, the trees whisper in her ear. She pushes away the branches and increases her speed. Faster. She's gasping for air, lungs burning as they constrict in her ribs under the pressure. Her muscles strain against the sudden movement after years without use. Her shoes splash into the mud, making her lose her balance as she slips and slides. Run, Hermione. She stumbles at Harry's voice, but quickly regains balance and rights herself. Her eyes are set forward and the forest blurs into green in her periphery. Her chest heaves as she forces air into her lungs, blood gushing furiously behind her eyes. Run, my love, her mother whispers. Hermione's eyes swell with tears, a cry simmers in her chest, and she wants to fall into the ground. Her hair whips against her face, sticking to her wet lips, obstructing her view of where she's going, but still, she doesn't stop. The waves crash louder, and she propels herself towards the sound, the edge of the cliff coming closer in view. Hermione doesn't know what she's trying to do, but she's not thinking about anything except for a singular thought, to just keep going. It's a sudden end. The cliff curves into nothingness. Her stomach drops, and she has 1 second to think maybe she won't make it. There's no one here to stop her now. Maybe she won't be able to stop herself in time, and this will be where it ends. But she only increases her speed, her heart jumping in her throat like a panicked rabbit. Run, Granger. It's the final voice that shakes her, gives her the strength to continue. Adrenaline pumping in her body, she sprints. And then, finally, she cries out and skids to a stop a mere distance away from the inn. Fragments of stones from under her feet roll over the jagged edge. Hermione falls to her knees at the sudden impact, hands falling in front of her to stop her face from hitting the ground. She grunts at the pain, head dipped low, gasping for air. Empty silence takes over her mind, despite her pulse throbbing in her temple. She remains in this position for several moments, until her vision clears and the bile in her mouth disappears, and then she lifts her head and looks over the edge and into the water. Her entire body shakes. She swallows the rock in her throat and pushes herself to her feet, wavering slightly against the protest of her legs. The wind is harsher here, cold and unforgiving. Hermione wipes the stinging tears on her cheeks and gently pushes the curls away from her face. She closes her eyes once more and forces herself to focus on the waves. They vibrate in her bones, each wave a drum that only makes the blood in her veins run faster, flooding into her heart with such intensity that she thinks it'll explode. She clenches into herself. Her bones turn rigid and locked. She tries to breathe in and out, as Malfoy told her, but it's too much at once. Overstimulation with the run, her standing on the edge in the ocean that is still very much an enemy. Her eyes move rapidly behind her closed lids, and she forces lungs to inhale and exhale, despite her mind instructing her to flee. It doesn't work, and she cries out in frustration. She grabs a rock lying beside her feet and whirls it across over the edge. It shoots outwards and arcs down before disappearing into the water. She bites her lip until she tastes metal. Then, when did she become so helpless, so inept to do anything substantial? She can't do it. Maybe it was a one-off, something she can only do with someone there to monitor. But she refuses to go to Malfoy and ask him to take her through the process once more. She doesn't need him. She doesn't want to need or be trapped by anyone. Shut it off, Granger. And that's the problem, she realizes. She's still thinking too much. She closes her eyes again and takes a deep breath, letting the waves envelop her, focusing on Malfoy's voice. And while she won't go to him for help, in the privacy of her mind, she'll let him in. Breathe in through your mouth and exhale through your nose. Focus on my voice. She does. Lets the memory of his voice reverberate throughout her body until she finally feels her body letting go of some of its tension. The shoulders relax, and the heaviness of her chest slowly dissipates. The roar of the ocean simmers down to the soft hum she'd hear when she'd place her ear against her mother's chest as a child, rising and falling to the tune of comfort. She manages to control her breaths and falls into the feeling of emptiness before conjuring her house. Hermione stands outside and looks up at the home that is a replica of her childhood home. The same 2 wicker chairs on the porch where her mother would sit every afternoon reading a book, and where her father would sit with a newspaper in his hands. There's a pot of white daffodils hanging from the railing that Hermione helped her mother plant. The same willow tree in front of the house that she'd see through her window and would eventually climb once she got over her fear of falling. Looking up at the childhood home creates a hollow pit in her stomach, and she bites her tongue to not let the image or herself crumble. Her knowledge of occlumency was that of protection, of warding oneself from the other. But what if the only one you wanted to protect your mind, your memories, were from yourself? Hermione knows she can change the house. It's her mind and her decision on how she wants to approach this. But she doesn't want to forget the emotions behind her memories. She sees it as a vital sign that she is, in fact, living. What she truly wants is to have a sense of control over them. Each memory and its associated emotion neatly organized, like a crisp folding of a dragonfly's wings, so that she's no longer driven to the edge of a cliff because of her blinding fear. She can use it to organize her thoughts and memories, a way to gain clarity, a way to keep all the precious moments somewhere safe to visit when she's ready. Something like the neat thud of a book pushed into a shelf, only for it to be picked up again, or the flip of a light switch that she could easily turn back on. Not an ending, just a meeting in the middle. The willow tree stands still across her bedroom window. Later, there will be a swing attached to one of the branches, and Hermione will spend her days reading under its canopy. For now, it stands alone, which is how she knows that the house is from a time before Hogwarts, before magic. She turns the doorknob and steps inside. Hermione, are you looking for me? I'm right here, my love. Hermione freezes. She immediately recognizes the memory. It's winter, 9 years old. She spent the entire afternoon outside in the snow. Hermione had been calling for her mother when she entered the house, slightly panicked because she couldn't feel her fingers after an hour of making a snowman. She'd been fine, of course, but back then Hermione would turn to her mother for every little thing that made her afraid. Now Hermione follows her mother's voice to the living room. She knows what is behind the door, but her breath still leaves her when she sees her mother curled in an armchair across their fireplace. Her mother looks up from a familiar Greek mythology book and smiles. Were you looking for me? A strangled sound leaves Hermione. It's just a memory, but like with the ones with Harry, it feels so unbelievably real. Is everything all right, Hermione? Hermione spins to the voice. Her father comes up from behind her, holding a blanket. He goes over to her mother and gently places it around her shoulders. Her mother gives him a tender smile and takes a seat on the chair's armrest. They both turn toward her, expectantly. She opens her mouth, but nothing comes out. She doesn't know what to say. She doesn't know what to do. The image of them together is so eerily familiar that it leaves her gutted. She'll never get to see them in person. She knows this is true, but she dreamt of all the things she could say to them if she did, by some miracle, get to see them. She wants to explain why she obliviated them, why it was necessary, because at the moment during the war when Moody told her what could happen to them, she saw no other way. She wants to tell them everything about the books she's published and the work she does, all her memories with her friends, all the things she's afraid of. She wants to tell them that people were getting better after the war. Somehow Harry was getting better, and that meant maybe one day she could get better. She also wants to tell them how against all odds she met Malfoy again, and he's so stubborn and infuriating, just as she once told them. But there's also something there in him, and she's trying just as her mother wanted her to. She thinks her mother would be proud of that. She wants to say so many things, but at this moment, everything suddenly becomes so meaningless. None of it matters except for the thing she must do first. She takes heavy steps towards them. The room is cold, despite the crackling fire, and it reminds her that despite it feeling all too real, it's still in her head. They could vanish if she opens her eyes, and this exact image of them would disappear. The smile never leaves her face as she slowly crouches down beside her mother's legs. She could say so many things, but when she opens her mouth, all that comes out is, "I'm sorry." It's what she wants to say to them the most. She's sorry because she took something away from them that she had no right to, because she'd do it again and again if it meant they were safe, and maybe for that she doesn't deserve their forgiveness, but she needs to say it anyways. I'm sorry," Hermione croaks again. If this is the only way she'll see them, she needs to say it so that they know. "Please, I'm so sorry." Her mother angles her head and looks down at Hermione, puzzled. "Hermione, it'll be all right." She can't meet her mother's eyes, so she looks away and shakes her head vehemently. Nothing about this is all right, and it's all too much for her to handle. It's too much for anyone to handle, and she can't imagine how any of this will be okay again. Soft, warm hands cup her face, and Hermione breaks into a sob. Her face is tilted up through the tears, and Hermione looks into the gentle eyes she realized she'd forgotten. She'd forgotten how her mother looked at her. "It'll be all right, my love." Her mother pulls a curl behind Hermione's ear. "You must know. Everything will be okay." How much had she craved to hear those words? Her throat closes and tears flood her eyes. She's breathing heavy as though she can't get in enough air for her to say what she needs to. Her words crumble together and she rasps, "I miss you so much. I miss you every single day." "We know, Hermione." Her father moves to stand behind her. She places a strong hand over her head, and the weight of it, the sheer presence of it, breaks her heart. "We're right here. We never left." And it's those words that she's been aching to hear that make her finally fall apart. With her father's hand still on her head, Hermione grips her mother close and sinks her head into her lap. Her body shakes and trembles as she weeps, repeating over and over, "I'll never forget you. I'll never forget you. I'll never forget you." When Hermione finally closes the door, which her parents sit with a firm click, she opens her eyes. Standing at the edge of the cliff, looking over the ocean, she touches her cheeks, expecting tears, but they're dry. She exhales a calm breath. Hermione looks over to the horizon where the ocean meets the sky, and she thinks maybe she forgot how to live when she realized there wasn't anyone watching her do so. But she realizes she is still here, even when there's no memory of her. She is still their daughter, even when they believe they have none. She lives and she remembers, and she tells herself it is not betraying their memory because doing one was the same as doing the other. A sound below directs her attention away from the ocean. Malfoy walks over to the shore, stark footprints in the sand following his steps. He stands there for a moment, looking so small at this distance, but just as steady as she's always known him. She watches him run a hand through his hair. It's a private moment, but she doesn't look away or turn around. There's a gust of wind, and he stiffens, one hand still in his hair, before turning to look over his shoulder as if expecting someone to be standing there. She notes the exact moment his eyes lift to where she stands. He raises a hand to cover his eyes from the sun that shines down brightly above her. She wonders how she might look to him. Standing at the cliff, he stopped her from falling. His face is blank, and while he squints against the sun, he doesn't look away from where he stands in the water. They watch each other, their silence only amplitude by the roar of the ocean. Maybe Malfoy also understands how time is as infinite as it is limited. That living like this right now means they'll have to remember the good with the awful. And maybe as long as they're alive, they'll have their memories with the possibility to create some new ones that won't hurt. And then eventually they won't feel like this anymore. Grief was, after all, just an imprint in the sand left behind by love and time, the water that wiped away its trace. And this grief that sticks to the palms of their hands, the tissues of their heart, it won't be there one day. It's only when Hermione looks away to face the water once more that Malfoy turns as well. She breathes in and tries to memorize this moment in time. The wisps of wind blow curls into her eyes. Water claws its way towards Malfoy's feet before sliding back. A house of sand dissolves into the tide. Further into the ocean, a hawk circles and circles and never lands. Hermione sneezes. "According to my mother's recipe, the key to a perfect tea is to not use your wand. It must be done with your hands, otherwise you won't be able to control the ingredients and the exact measurements. Are you listening, Hermione?" "I'm sick, Amina," Hermione moans and sneezes again. On top of lack of sleep and a night out in the storm, she overexerted herself with occlumency. She should have known that overdoing her mind would result in getting sick, and now every inch of her body was screaming in exhaustion and pain. There was a pending headache throbbing in the back of her head. "Here, take this. It's the last one." Hermione looks at the orange in her hand and unwillingly blushes. Now, the second key is to have fresh mint. Not something powdered or from the shop. It must be plucked directly from the plant before you make tea. Otherwise, the taste and aroma will not be the same. "Now, Hermione, first you must cut the mint leaves and then ground them." Hermione scoots closer where she sits on the counter and watches Amina take out the kitchen knife. "You have to slice them very thin," Amina explains, "and then ground the leaves and boil them with water and let it steep. My mother used to say that the strength of the tea leaves was directly related to how much your partner loved you. And you know what they say, a loving partner is the same as a life filled with riches. She's never heard anyone say that. Really? Hermione mumbles, chewing an orange slice. How strong was your mother's tea? Amina gives a short laugh. Not very, but don't worry. When you make this tea, I have a good feeling it'll be bitter. Why would bitter mean good? I don't know. Maybe John likes bitter tea? He doesn't drink tea. Amina doesn't notice the change in Hermione's voice. Well, that's good then. It won't matter if it's bitter or not if he doesn't drink it. Or actually, now I'm confused. I'm not sure what the protocol is when your partner doesn't like tea. Draco, I'm making tea. Would you like some? Malfoy pauses in the hallway just outside the kitchen entrance. His eyes fall on Hermione before shifting to Amina. Now? Well, not now. I'm making it so you can wait here for the first glass. If you pay attention, you might learn something to woo a girl with. Her stomach twists and lurches when he steps into the kitchen. She watches him from the corner of her eyes as he leans against the counter from across where Hermione sits. They're back in the same position as last night, except there's daylight, and the room feels almost cosmic now that he's here. I have other things in my armory that work. I think I'll be okay, Malfoy says wryly. I hope you're not talking about your charm, Hermione quips. She's not sure what prompted her to speak to him, but she still doesn't look away when Malfoy's eyes snap to her. Malfoy cocks his head. You think I'm charming? She frowns. No, that's not. My mother used to say whoever got the first sip of tea would live to see 100 years worth of gold. Amina interrupts. She digs through the cupboards. Perhaps Granger should get the first sip then, because I'm already rich. Hermione glowers at him. Perhaps not, Malfoy. My tea will be bitter enough. Okay, he replies, looking at her strangely. Whatever that means. After the tea has steeped, you have to stir once clockwise and then twice the opposite direction, Amina continues. And to pour, you can just bring it up high and pour directly into a glass. How's John anyway, Hermione? Hermione stops breaking apart the orange. What do you mean? Well, didn't he write to you? You got a letter, no? I thought it must be him. Right, sure, he wrote to me. She glances at Malfoy, who gazes at her steadily. She immediately looks back at Amina and schools her face. He's doing fine. We're talking about John Archibald, Draco, Amina explains, as though he might care. He's running in the upcoming election. Do you know him? Never heard of him. Look how high I'm bringing the pot. Of course, the first time you try it this way, it pours everywhere but into the glass. With practice, however, it gets better. John must be so busy with the election coming up soon, Hermione. Sweet, oblivious Amina. Hermione doesn't want to have this conversation, but she also isn't going to bring up her breakup with John in front of Malfoy. She tries to catch Amina's eyes, who remains very much invested in making the perfect tea, and Hermione resorts to keeping the conversation short. Yes, he's very busy. Malfoy stares at Hermione with a dark, disapproving look. She narrows her eyes at him in response and pops an orange slice in her mouth. His assessing gaze dips to her mouth briefly as she chews before meeting her eyes once more. I can only imagine the toll it takes on you. Always away for business, never enough time for you. My father was a city minister for 3 years, and my mother absolutely hated it. They were always arguing about how he was involved in politics, but didn't give two shits about his family. Amina stops to think. My mother really should have taken her tea seriously. What do you do after with the tea? Hermione asks, trying to reorient Amina. Well, it's done now. You let it steep, and then you add however many sugars you want. Amina's words trail as she looks at Hermione, eyes widening slightly, before slowly turning to Malfoy. Draco, now that I have you here, I was wondering about something. Yes, Amina, Draco responds wearily. Hermione suspects Amina lured Malfoy in with tea for this conversation. Malfoy's face confirms he's thinking the same thing. Amina scratches her neck and shrugs casually. Considering we're already behind on schedule because of the storm and we're predicted to have another very heavy rainfall tonight, we'll most likely be leaving tomorrow night. Malfoy simply crosses his arms against his chest. He looks at Amina with the patience of someone who's waiting for a child to confess they've set the house on fire. Hermione watches the two of them with fascination. Well, everyone is feeling so down, Amina says, gesturing to Hermione, who looks at her confused at being singled out. I'm thinking we'll do a night out in the town tonight to get the spirits all up and running again. Wouldn't that be fun? Nothing too over the top, mind you. We'll just eat dinner and dance and get drunk. I probably shouldn't be hearing about all the ways you'll be spending the money I'm giving, Malfoy drawls. Hermione scowls. The Queen's reign is over, Draco. You can't tell me what to do. Of course, but it's not really the Queen's money, is it? Hermione pouts. Please let us go get drunk one last time, Draco, before we inevitably wither away in the inferno that is the desert. You just need to agree for logistics' sake. Malfoy rolls his eyes, giving in a lot easier than Hermione thinks he would. And Amina grins. I'll tell the others. Here, this should help with the congestion. Amina places a glass of steaming tea in Hermione's hands. Also, Hermione, you're coming. She calls after Amina as she leaves the kitchen. I'm sick, Amina. Hermione slowly turns towards Malfoy and repeats pathetically, I'm sick. He stares at her for a long moment. All right. Her eyes drop to her hands, and she has the orange in her left and the tea in her right, both facing upward as though she's giving him an offering of sorts. She feels the need to say something now that he isn't leaving first, but she's unsure how to approach any topic after their whole night together. There's a level of hesitancy that comes with every shift in a relationship, and she's just not sure how to be around him, when in her mind, things have changed drastically between them. Relationship, she wants to laugh at that. They're not even friends, but it feels different. It feels like something that doesn't need to be defined by a label just yet. He saved her, and now that she's gotten over the initial humiliation of him seeing her vulnerable, she's grateful enough for that and for him teaching her occlumency. It doesn't matter to her if he hasn't reached the same level with her just yet. Things can be like this right now, and it's okay. Hermione also wants to ask what he was doing outside, but then that opened him up to ask what she was doing on the cliff. Maybe she should tell him about her progress so far, if only to confirm the fact that she's learning occlumency at a faster rate than when he'd probably done it. She lifts her eyes back to Malfoy, but whatever she's about to say disappears as she catches him already watching. All he ever does is stare and make judgments about her in his mind, and she knows it's judgment when he looks at her. She can see it in his eyes, the way they focus on her hair or her clothes. She is of the mind to tell him that his manners are outrageous, and it's completely hypocritical of him to just yap on about how she judges him when he goes ahead and stares at her. She'll tell him eventually, but not right now, because she's sick. Obviously not because of the way he's looking at her and how it's making her nervous again. She carefully places the tea on the counter beside her. I should probably. Why him? Hermione stops, making her way off the counter. What? Why Josh? John, she corrects. His name is John. You know who he is? He gives her a blank look. His father is the Minister of International Magical Cooperation, William Archibald. Malfoy blinks. His face gives no recollection of what she's talking about. They're a very prominent family. She sniffs, hating how she sounds. She's never cared about John's family or their prominent role in society. If anything, she's shied away from it all. The attention, the constant need to be careful of what she says around them. She's only met John's parents less than a handful of times, and each encounter was more brutal and stifling than the one before. But she doesn't believe for 1 second Malfoy doesn't know who John or his father is. The Archibald family were in the UK for business before the war until they finally settled once William became a minister. They at least run in the same social circle where Malfoy did whatever work he claimed to do. He's from New York, she adds when he doesn't acknowledge what she's saying. That's unfortunate. She glares at him. She doesn't know why she feels a sudden need to defend John against Malfoy. But it's as though she needs to explain John, if only to explain herself. Don't mock him, Malfoy. He's a wampus. That's really not helping. It's a legitimate and well-respected house in Ilvermorny. He looks bored. All right, Granger. You just don't understand anything different from you. The only good thing to ever come out of America was Whitney Haven. Whitney Haven? Hermione looks at him surprised. The singer? The witch is at least 60 years old now. She stopped singing 20 years ago. But she'd been popular in her time, and the public's admiration for her continued for several years after she retired. Even Hermione, who's pretty clueless about the wizarding entertainment scene, knew about her because Ron used to keep a newspaper clip of her from when she visited London. Fred and George had snuck out to see a private singing event for the ministry. He shrugs, unbothered by her evident shock. She was good at what she did. Which of her songs do you like? Also, how old were you when you first started liking her? Because that changes a lot of things. Malfoy ignores her. Why him, Granger? I don't have to explain myself to you. Malfoy plays with the ring on his finger, his thumb brushing against the emerald stone. His eyes don't leave her face. I just want to know what it'll take to get the golden girl. Trust me, Malfoy, she remarks. That's not something you'll ever need to worry about. He stretches his legs out and leans back, looking relaxed and unconcerned with her response. His nonchalance annoys her, even though he's seemingly agreeing with her, and she's fine with it because she's well aware of the reasons as to why Malfoy would be the last man on Earth she'd ever be with. But his indifference leaves her wondering what his reasons are. She's well acquainted with at least half of them, and he's practically made it his lifelong mission for her to know. But a little ball of indignation makes her want to know the rest. She's curious to know if the reasons are the same as before or if there are some new additions to his list. She pauses to consider his response, and it seems to be a terrible situation, sure to leave her feeling miserable. So for once, she drops it. Hermione traces the blue and white patterns of the counter, dipping into the grooves between each tile. He asked me, and I said yes. He asked you, Malfoy echoes slowly. Do you say yes to any bloke who asks you? She scoffs at the unimpressed look he shoots her and flips her hair over her shoulder. Despite what people might think, there isn't a line of potential men waiting for me. There was just John, and he was persistent. So are dogs. Maybe you just need a pet. Hermione excels. Right. I'm leaving. I'm sure he'll be waiting at your doorstep the minute you go back home, his tail wagging and mouth drooling. We're actually not together right now. Hermione cuts in, sharply. So you could stop trying to make me feel bad about being with him. Silence stretches out between them. Hermione refuses to look at him, but she can feel his gaze on her nevertheless. She hates this. She doesn't even know why she's brought it up. She loathed talking about John with her friends as it is, but somehow, and almost always against her will, she ends up sharing things about herself with Malfoy that she knows he doesn't care about, and she feels forced to come up with a better explanation. Why? Malfoy asks finally. There's a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. He could be talking about why the sky is blue for all the lack of actual concern that's on his face. She's unsure how she still feels about the whole situation with John, and she's of the mind to ignore it all until she returns home. Talking about him with Malfoy makes her feel as if she's betraying something, and that's even more confusing. Hermione gives him a flat look, hoping to mask the painful twist of her heart. You can't seriously expect me to tell you. He doesn't disagree, but he sets his jaw, and he looks at her evenly. He's an idiot, Granger. He's really not, Hermione retorts, rolling her eyes. And you don't need to say that because he's very intelligent and successful. His voice is short and annoyed. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. Hermione shakes her head in disbelief. You hate everyone you meet. You say you don't know anything about him, and yet you go around making assumptions based on nothing. I don't want to know him. I'll be the happiest man in this fucked world if I never meet him. Just don't defend him, Granger. Not to me. He says it like it should mean something to her. Like he's someone that matters when it comes to these things. Hermione shakes her head again, unconvinced. What about you? What about me? Do you have someone? She cringes internally. Hermione twirls the tea, watching the mint leaves dance around in the hot liquid. Someone for what? Malfoy. Sometimes. Malfoy looks amused. But you don't believe in love, she says slowly, carefully. So what are you looking for from these women? Other than sex, you mean? Nothing, he admits. She glances at him. Except you don't need someone for what you can do yourself, do you? Malfoy's mouth twitches. His eyes bore into her to perhaps make her feel embarrassed, but for once she doesn't squirm or blush. He runs his tongue across his teeth and says, No, I guess I don't. So then, she pushes. I'm fucking them, Granger. There's nothing more. Her cheeks finally turn into the flames at Hermione, and Hermione looks away. He can be so crude sometimes. She left not knowing how to respond. She hasn't read anything specific in the papers about the women he's with, and it's not like Malfoy makes it easy for anyone to know what he's doing either. He's hardly ever in public, but sometimes there will be a rare mention of a woman or a name she doesn't recognize associated with his. She doesn't doubt that Malfoy has his share of lovers, or rather, considering she doubts there's a single ounce of romantic emotion in his body, he'll spare for anyone, women he brings to his bed. Either way, regardless of what people might think of him and his role in the war, Malfoy was always going to be an eligible bachelor. His money and inheritance status hadn't changed because of the war, and as a result, neither did the women he attracted. Even when he was in school, she knew about the rumors that circulated him about courting women when he'd come of age. There were expectations from him. He had responsibilities as the Malfoy heir and a member of the pureblood aristocracy to find someone who was of the same status as him. There was nothing there about marrying for love, but love never mattered when it came to upholding the pureblood name. She'd think it was sad if she didn't know his thoughts on love now. However, whatever point she was trying to make about this now leaves her feeling worse than when they were talking about John. You must have them waiting in a line for you, though, she says, tall, young, and beautiful. Not always tall, no. Hermione just hums. She can imagine the women now. She thinks of them in beautiful dresses, handcrafted somewhere in Italy just for their bodies. Stunning, frosted jewelry dripping on their long, delicate necks, the kind of jewelry that had to be stored away and guarded in vaults at the end of the day. They'd match Malfoy in money and personality. Women who would sway on his arm like vines in the hanging gardens. Never to outshine him, of course. They were simply there to highlight the everlasting green that was Malfoy. She thinks about those women, and it makes her feel lonely. Are you jealous, Granger? Malfoy's voice is traced with something low that makes her look up at him. She gives him an incredulous look. What? No. He pushes himself away from the counter and takes a step towards her. Why? Why would you even think that? You sound jealous. I'm not, she says firmly. If anything, I'm jealous they're free of you when I'm stuck with you here. She inhales sharply when he comes closer. His hand grips the counter beside her as he leans in, shifting so he settles in between her knees that somehow widen on their own to accommodate him. Her legs burn where they touch him, making roots and branches of fever in her body. He must have taken a shower recently because all she can smell is vanilla and sandalwood, and she wants to close her eyes in the warmth he's radiating. She hopes she doesn't sneeze. You don't have to be jealous, Granger, he murmurs, angling his head lower to catch her eyes where she starts to look away. There's a brush of his skin against her hand, but she can't move away from his face to see what he's doing. I'm here, aren't I? Later, she'll think of how they always end up being like this, in each other's space, breathing in while the other breathes out. Once he was nowhere, and now he's everywhere, and she doesn't think she'll ever get used to him being this close to her. Can't ever get over the strangeness of them being together anywhere. And she'll wonder how he always finds a way to touch her, and why it feels so different from the other times when she's been touched by a man, touched by John. Now she blinks furiously to divert her attention away from the freckled shade of gray in his eyes. He straightens, meets her eyes once more, and steps back. He smirks when he takes in how disoriented she is. Her hands feel empty, and it's only when he leaves that she's brought back to where she sits alone in the kitchen that she looks down to find her orange gone. Well, that was the end of chapter 13. I'm excited. I'm going to try to get as many episodes out in the next couple of days as I can. So, see you in the next one.